Welcome to this special Earth Day interactive webinar, Progress and Inequality in the 21st Century, presented by the Henry George School of Social Science at henrygeorgeschool.org, featuring Andrew Mazzone, President of the Henry George School, and Scott Baker, President of Common Ground, New York, and author of America is Not Broke, which he will be talking about more later. And Ed Dodson is senior researcher of the Henry George School of Philadelphia. He will be the discussant. My name is Rick Ulfik. I'm the founder of We the World and the We campaign at we.net. And this webinar is part of the Economic Justice Campaign, which we will talk more about later. Today being Earth Day, we make the connection between the land that sustains us and economic justice with a focus on equality, on inequality, unfortunately. Since the crash of 2008, 95% of the economic recovery has gone to 1% of the population. Before 2008, there were 1.6 million homeless children in the United States. Now there are 2.5 million homeless children. The wealth of one family, the Walton family, now equals the wealth of more than 40% of all Americans. All that money flowing to the top is threatening our democracy, raising the stakes in unprecedented ways. The Koch brothers alone, that's two people, have apparently pledged $900 to make sure Hillary Clinton does not win in 2016. And now each member of Congress has to spend an average of 4 to 6 hours of every working day just doing fundraising to keep up. On today's webinar, we will be looking at this enormous problem of inequality in the context of issues raised in a recent Smart Talk dialogue between Andrew Mazzone and Yanis Varoufakis, Greece's new foreign finance minister. We will get into the issue of Greece and austerity in the European Union, as well as Thomas Picketty's book, Capital in the 21st Century. To get us started, our moderator for today at our webinar will be Ibrahima Drame. He is the Education Development Manager for the Henry George School, and he's also a faculty member. Thank you, Ibrahima.
Thanks a lot, Rick. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for taking off time from your busy schedule to honor us with your presence at this webinar. Let me quickly explain how we will proceed tonight. First, we will allow our speakers to make their presentations, and then we will have Mr. Ed Dodson step in to give some comments before we open up the floor to the audience. So without any delay, I'm going to let Andy step in and start his conversation. Thank you, Andy.
Okay, thanks for joining us. We're picking up a dialogue that I had with Yanis Varoufakis, who is the finance minister of Greece. We had the dialogue before he became finance minister, and we certainly didn't know he would become finance minister. He's an excellent economist, very sharp guy. We thought he'd make a great guest on Smart Talk, and we did have him on twice. It was in the context of that between my first talk with Yanis and the second, Thomas Piketty's book came out, Capital. Now, Thomas Piketty's book is seminal in one significant way. He documented income distributions over the last 200 years so thoroughly and so completely that it's clear that, with the exception of two periods in the last 200 years, basically World War I and World War II, and the areas just preceding them or closely following them, that income became more equal during those periods, simply because it was wartime conditions, there was fear of massive depression and possibly revolution, that the system gave ground and opened up income opportunities that didn't exist before. But before that time, and since 1970, things in the system have reverted back to the way they were. And now to read some evil intent in this, I think, is to take too hard a look at why the income distributions are what they are. They essentially show that relatively few people end up with most of the wealth in a capitalist system. And I think this happens behind the backs of everybody, even the people who get the wealth. I mean, the people who get the wealth are obviously smart, capable people. But there's something fundamental in the structure of the system that tends to inequality. Now, during the period of World War II and post-World War II, we had significant reforms in the United States, the so-called Roosevelt reforms, where you control stock markets, you control banking, you had Social Security, you had bank guarantees against losing your money as a depositor. A whole series of regulations interfered with the, quote, free market to minimize or damage the untrammeled effects of open competition or monopoly. So this worked quite well, but by the 70s it was felt that those rules were becoming archaic, especially when the Soviet Union fell and communism fell. There was a reaction to that, basically saying, well, look, if you have regulation, that may be okay, but if you have continuous regulation and super regulation, a la the Soviet Union, that ultimately you would strangle and choke. So the idea was, let's get rid of regulation and let's give regulation, no regulation, a chance. And in a way, the United States peeled back in the 1970s many of the regulations of the Roosevelt period. There was a tremendous boom in growth and ultimately a tremendous crash in 2008. I'm not going to dissect that. That's been well documented. But in Picketty's book, which is the important thing here, he's basically making the case there's a fundamental long-term tendency of incomes for most people to be pushed to the margin, basically to basic reproduction. Now, Picketty is not a radical. He's on the left, but his book, he said, let the facts speak for themselves. He also has some formulas, basically saying or trying to prove why this was so. I think that's a weak part of his book, and the discussions with Yanis Varoufakis kind of expose that his formulas for proving the inevitability of capital dominating labor so completely is really not sustained in Picketty's book itself. But nonetheless, Picketty's statistics, along with the Occupy movement, has galvanized everybody into thinking, wow, this may be true. Keep in mind, 10 years ago, or before that, even if those trends were evident, there was total denial that, oh no, that's not true, it didn't exist, that can't be. Now there's acknowledgement that these trends do exist, and Hillary Clinton herself, who, in a way, kind of hilarious for Hillary, but nonetheless, she's the zeitgeist of the times. But going back to Georgia's issue with Picketty, we're not arguing about his statistics in income distribution. Hillary's joined up. She wants to help eliminate unequal distributions of wealth and unfairness, etc. So, the establishment has got it, but in the final analysis, no one's going to give anything up if they've got it. So to know what's going on is one thing. To know how to change things is quite another. And so I just wanted to make that point. We understand what the situation is. It's clear what the situation is. People like Picketty have demonstrated what the situation is. We Georgians say if you want a robust solution, not a total solution, but a robust solution, all you have to do is introduce land value, resource value taxation, and immediately you start to relieve that problem and bring things down closer to equality, and then you can deal with the other issues of equality in detail. But you need a grand solution, and the grand solution was always don't allow individuals to monopolize nature. Nature is owned by everybody. Let everybody keep their own income, their own profits, but not use nature to build up super profits. So that's kind of a Georgist position, and we're pointing out, now that everyone knows that, to change that is going to be quite a battle, because I myself, if I were an investment banker, and I'm getting fed money because I blew the system up, made a lot of money blowing it up with credit booms caused by, allowing everyone to export to this country and then buy American dollars to keep their currencies low so they can continue this kind of trade, and then lend them back to the United States, who can lend them back to the bankers, who can then not invest in real companies, especially in the United States, but could reinvest those in securities and trading and derivatives and all kinds of financial instruments that they could trade amongst themselves, trade with everyone, and make enormous profits over and over again, blow everybody up, and get refinanced by the same banks and so forth. This is a wonderful perpetual motion machine. Why would you give it up? If I was sitting in the banking halls at Wall Street, I'd be looking around and saying, this is the greatest system ever invented for us, guys. And we're smart, and we're tough, and we're slick, because if we weren't, how did we get in this position where we can do this? And the question is, what can we do about that? Is Hillary Clinton the answer? She says she's for the people. Now, I'm being facetious here, because poor old Hillary, she's ridden a winning horse for 20 to 25, 30 years, whatever, with Billy. They made a lot of money. They got a foundation worth $1 billion. They collected a lot of money from overseas, from all her friends and people she can do favors for. And I don't think Hillary's about to change that, although she's now impersonating a populist. Of course, the real populist, Elizabeth Warren, somehow has been talked out of running for president, which gives you an idea of just how powerful the forces are. Because if Elizabeth Warren ran for president against Hillary, the uproar and the outcry and the support that she would have would just simply drown Hillary. But that is not going to happen. There's too much money involved. Hillary will no doubt be the next president. Big money will support a right-wing lunatic candidate. They can't get elected. Hillary will win by default, and she'll tell everybody she'll help ease your pain. Anyway, that's my preamble. That's a kind of a Georgist look at what the situation is. And now I'm going to throw it to Scott Baker, who's a Georgist in detail, a very famous Georgist now. In his writings, he's written over 200 articles on various aspects of this problem in detail, and he's very familiar with how to make change and how to document why change should be made in a certain way. So, Scott, go ahead.
Thank you. I don't know if I can improve on that. That was a very detailed explanation itself of Picketty and the situation that we all find ourselves in. I'm going to try and get more detail in terms of Picketty's theory and why it doesn't work, and what some other commentators who are smarter than me and more involved Georgists and longer-term Georgists than I am have to say about it. All right. Now, first of all, I want to give a little bit of credit to Picketty before we start criticizing him. He says himself right up front that his book is as much a work of history as economics. And so far, he's been criticized primarily by economists and journalists. It would be interesting to see an historian take a look at his 200 to 300 years of data and see if they think it's accurate or if he missed something. Now, on the reading list, Mason Gaffney has a paper where he does do some of that, and we'll talk about that a little bit too. But right now, let's say that Picketty is generally correct in his description, but his theory, such as it is either not a theory, it's more of a description, or it has some problems. The biggest problem, of course, is, as Andy already pointed out, and basically everybody on the reading list has pointed out, is that he conflates land especially. I want to pause because he also conflates labor, as a matter of fact, between 1770 and 1860 in America, with slave labor included as part of capital. So there, in effect, you're actually including human beings, and it makes a difference in terms of the wealth concentration because he says that the slave values went up 150% during that period, and eventually comprised 40% of the wealth in the South in 1860. So you can see what they were losing. But this is the problem with Picketty, is he basically takes a legalistic formula or definition of wealth. In other words, whatever is legally considered as wealth is what he considers as wealth for that time period, instead of coming up with an economic theory to support what should be wealth, and then saying, well, something is wealth and something else is land and something else is labor, the way we Georgists do. Actually, capital, land, and labor. He conflates wealth with capital as well, which is another criticism Varoufakis has. Okay, so with that big asterisk, that would have been something on his book, a very huge asterisk, but he wanted to write Capital in the 21st Century and roll everything up into that. So now there's a number of critiques based on that roll-up. They're in your reading list, but also another one that I came up with is a fellow named Matthew Raganelli, who's a 26-year-old MIT student, and he argues that the capital gains in the last 30, 40 years are basically due to housing improvements or housing growth. So that basically you haven't got any growth in capital. As a matter of fact, you haven't got any over 100 years. But what seems like a growth is really a growth in the housing value of housing, which is to say land, because housing itself is a depreciable asset. It's a capital asset. It depreciates over time, unless it's fixed up, but then you're putting more money in, so it's a net depreciation. So land is really what's appreciated. And Joseph Stiglitz backs that up as well. And also on your reading list, Peter Orszag, who used to be the OMB director under Obama, Office of Management and Budget, he refers to Stiglitz as well as his own conclusions that basically housing and land are the reason that we see what seems like capital appreciation. So right away we have a problem with Picketty's formula, R is greater than G, where he says the rate of return on capital is greater than the growth of the economy as a whole, because if you take away the land factor, it is not. So already we can basically almost dispense with his main formula, except to say that people are, a certain class of people, 1%, are in fact profiting from that capital, as they call it, but it's really land. So Picketty says that there's basically a U-shape in the wealth curve. There was a great amount of wealth disparity pre-World War I. Then it went down because of the war, because of the taxation to pay for the war and the physical destruction of land, which a lot of the rentier class owned, and the kind of jumbling up of property and ownership from that war, and then again from the Second World War and in between the Great Depression. That caused a lot of the old school of rentier, who were landowners, to lose a lot of their wealth, basically. And this continued, and deliberately so, because of the reforms under Roosevelt and later under Europe, when it got back on its feet, up until 1980. And so Picketty acknowledges this, but he also seems to indicate that he believes that it's the shooting wars, as Mason Gaffney calls them, that are responsible, and not policy changes. And this is the other big failing with Picketty. Basically, he dismisses policy and he uses a demographic technological paradigm instead, in which he says basically the growth in population and the growth in technology will inevitably result in a high wealth concentration to the 1%. And he dismisses any policy salve as a temporary and maybe artificial measure, if even that. Positive side, he does have good data, and he goes back and he, as a historian, he starts with people like Jane Austen and de Balzac, and uses literary sources, and he says these are actually accurate. and they show the 19th century, early 19th century distribution of wealth quite well, and that the rentier class made its money off of land and its ownings and also bonds. And that basically it didn't matter what you did for work. Your work was not your main source of income. In fact, if you had to work, that was actually seen as a failing because the working middle class was not much better off than the working class. Basically, you made your money from either inherited wealth or marrying somebody who had inherited wealth. And that's why you have those kind of stories in Jane Austen's time. So another problem with Picketty is that he talks about the demographic, the growth of the population inevitably resulting in more wealth. But then again, he also talks about Thomas Malthus's time, and he says that the rent, the proportion of money going into rent also grew, and actually the wealth did not grow. And he says that Malthus, he says correctly, that Malthus observed that the poor were not getting richer as they multiplied. In fact, they were getting poorer. So if Picketty was correct that all you needed was demographic growth and the kind of technological progress that came along with that, then that would make people wealthier. Well, then how come Malthus was correct, at least in his superficial analysis of what was happening in society at his time? And Picketty doesn't dispute that. So that's another problem. Varoufakis points out that basically Piketty's got three laws which are not actually laws, but what Picketty uses to advance his cause. The first one is a tautology, that's the R is greater than G, which springs from a second somewhat more worked out theory, which Mason Gaffney says doesn't even raise to the level of hypothesis, let alone theory or law, which is basically that the return to wealth is so great, in fact it's greater than 5% over time, that return to capital actually, and Picketty deliberately conflates capital and wealth, and in fact there's a section in his book where he says he deliberately mixes the two and uses them interchangeably. Anyway, so he says that the return to capital will be so great that eventually the capital and the wealth is going to slip over to the top 1% or the top decile, and labor will be left with very little. And so this is an inevitable result of capitalism, according to Picketty, and that's why you get R is greater than G. So that's two of his three theorems, which are self-referencing. The third one is, as Varoufakis says, is basically a triviality, and it's just that inherited wealth will tend to accumulate and grow over time. The only thing that Picketty adds to that is that people are living longer now, so they have more time in which to grow their wealth before they pass it on to their heirs. But that doesn't change the basic formula, except in the sense that there's not as much human turnover or as much chance for the capital to be dissipated from heirs who can't manage the capital or manage to grow it. But nevertheless, the basic premise is the same, that it continues in dynasties. And now that we're having a sort of serious discussion, at least on the Republican side, of not taxing any inherited wealth at all, and foregoing many, I think it's $300 or $400 billion or something like that in inherited wealth in the form of taxes on that wealth. Now that we're having that discussion again, the dynasty plutocracy will continue if they have their way. So that is a problem. Okay, so Picketty doesn't seem to have any idea of what locational value is. He does talk about real estate and land being separate from manufactured capital early on in the book, but then he says that the buildings and the land are too difficult to disaggregate, and so he doesn't even try after that, and after that point basically land is just rolled up into capital, and he never even attempts to discuss them separately after about page 130 or so. Now he says that fixed capital equals 1/2 of the capital in developed countries on page 48. So that's including his buildings, infrastructure, and he includes land in that too. He calls that fixed capital. And then he believes that because of the wealth concentration that we're seeing now, which is almost at the level of the Gilded Age again, that this actually will slow down growth. And here he seems to have some pretty good support historically, because it is not, he points out, to the advantage of a rentier. If you're somebody collecting rent, there's no reason for you to want technological progress, because technological progress, says Picketty and others, actually originates from the middle class and from the disruptors of society. So Picketty says that if you don't want to be displaced as a rentier, you would actually discourage progress. You would just prefer to collect rent on your existing assets and not have anything disrupt that chain for you or your heirs. So he says, and that's the motivational aspect of it. Now the operative aspect is that you're sucking the money out of the middle class, which could otherwise be used by more innovative people, and basically turning it into rent, so that rent is displacing any innovative process that could change society and make it advance and grow. So he says because of that operative process, that we're due to slow down our progress and our growth, the G portion of the R is greater than G, to historical norms. And he says that the historical norm is never more than 1.5% for any extended period, and is closer to actually 0.1% growth, which is much slower, of course, than anybody living today is used to. Now, I don't know what he determined to be long term, but you start to ask this question. Well, India and China have now grown for a generation at either double-digit or high single-digit rates. So does that disprove Piketty's contention that you can't have sustained high growth? I would argue that it does, and not only as a Georgist, but as a greenbacker, because I would argue that if you control your source of money, if you have control over your money, if it's sovereign money as China has, and to a certain extent India has, because they have the largest state bank system in the world in terms of branches, that you actually can ride over the slow periods by simply issuing more currency and putting it into the infrastructure and into things that government can support, and so you can grow your way out of any recession that comes along because of banks withdrawing the currency and the credit from the society. So that is not that's almost a corollary to Georgist argument that the wealth from the land will get inflated artificially by banks, and then eventually you'll have a crash because people can't afford it anymore. So at least the temporary solution to that, if you don't have a land value tax to prevent it in the first place, is to inject more wealth back into the society, actually more money, not wealth. And so you can do that if you control the monetary supply, which some people say we do in America. I would argue that we don't. Okay, so that's his contention. And also he points out that the great levels of debt started after World War I, so that we didn't have, before that we didn't have such high debt, that we've had that since then, and we have basically grown by financing and not by capital growth and by the things that we think that we've grown by. There's several periods of growth. Picketty identifies a second one in the Georgist time leading up to World War I, which includes automobiles and electricity and radio somewhat, and the things that would lead eventually to air flight. But these are the kind of technological mega factors that allowed the world to grow at a fast rate. Now you had a phase 3 after 1960, which is kind of the electronic revolution technologically, but that actually turns out to have less of an impact on growth because it's basically just shuttling information around. It's lot of entertainment and a lot of communication, but the main things are the things that happened in the preceding period, where you had transportation innovation with cars and trains and so forth, and airplanes. So we don't really have that level of growth from technology. So, you know, again, his inevitable technological growth thesis is not really accurate, or in any case, particularly dependent on any period in history. Okay, so now he also makes this claim that government assets and government debt zero out because basically the assets equal the debt. So that we have $18 trillion in debt right now, and according to him, that's what we have in assets. Now, I just have to say this is completely wrong, because I've examined some of the asset statements of various local and state governments myself, and I've done some research on this, and I know it's well over 18 trillion, first of all, and second of all, there's no relation between the debt and the asset base. There just is no causal factor why one should equal the other. So I've seen, and when we talk about my book a little later, we'll maybe talk about that a little bit, but I've seen that the assets are far higher than the debt, and as further proof of that, you've noticed that there are a number of sovereign wealth funds, everywhere from Norway to Saudi Arabia, which have billions of dollars, or close to $1 trillion in some cases, to invest, and these are these are surplus funds that governments have. So, you know, they don't have that level of debt, number one. They may even be in surplus. And number two, there's no relation between their surplus and their funds and their level of debt. So he's just simply wrong about that, and I don't know how else to put that. Okay, so we've talked about his formulas. Now he says himself that his formula for growth of capital exceeding growth of the national income won't work if you would include natural resources. Well, of course, as Georgists, we say they should be included.
This, for the United States, will be fatal to middle-class people in the near term, and it's almost unthinkable. So I think the United States will not sit idly by. I mean, it's like the Greek situation. If the Greeks pull out of the euro and not pay the debt, and start a contagion there, that could reverberate around the world. And I don't know how that would impact on the American dollar, but if the Greeks go and use Chinese currency as their local currency, and in effect introduce a new reserve currency to the back door, I don't know if the United States can sit idly by or would, because game over. They would have a revolution for real in this country, because the standard of living going down by 30% on top of what's happened would make it intolerable for well over 50% of the population. So I think you would have a severe crisis. I can't think of anything other than nuclear war which would cause more damage in the short term to America than we lose the reserve currency status. I'm Andrew Mazzone, and that's my take on this.